So today's talk, I'm going to be talking about applying DevRel Foundation resources to application security. So in some ways, this is a story about how I got involved with the foundation and started working on some of the projects to take advantage of some of the problems I was facing in my own role leading a security advocacy team. So for the DevRel Foundation, it was talked about in the keynote as well. The DevRel Foundation is on a mission to elevate the professional practice of developer relations and increase awareness of it as a driver of business value. That's a little bit of the model, but the context for me is I help with Semgrep Community Edition, as well as the Semgrep platform in general, which is an open source static application security testing engine. So it's about the semantics of source code and looking for application security vulnerabilities. So I am now part of the steering committee of the DevRel Foundation. Started initially as managing one of the working groups focused on aggregating resources. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means, but I also lead, initially was called the Developer Relations Group, have rebranded into security advocacy, and a little bit of behind that will come through here, I think. So starting in my role, leading developer relations, I have done DevRel at a number of companies, including General Electric, Dolby Laboratories, Here Technologies, so doing mapping, IoT, media and entertainment, very different industries, and then moving into security. But noting that some people within the security community didn't know what DevRel is either, even at the company, in terms of trying to understand how to relate to it. So there is an official definition on the DevRel Foundation's website that developer relations is the practice of building and nurturing relationships, and relationships being in the name, but both externally and internally through community engagement, technical support, education, and advocacy to enable successful adoption of an organization's developer products and drive business value. And so I think this applies both to open source projects, but also commercial vendors who are trying to get adoption, technology adoption. And so a couple of the challenges I was facing coming into this role within application security was, well, how do you go about setting up a new developer relations program from scratch? What tools do I have access to? What constraints should I consider in getting things in place? What systems do I need to configure and make it so that my team and other teams can be very productive? And so that's what some of the questions I was starting with there. If I'm getting started in a new industry, so as I said, I was coming across a couple of different other domains into security, and so since I did not have an app security background, it became, well, how do you investigate a new community? How do you learn what they do? What's the difference between an AppSec engineer and a developer? Are they the same person or are they different people? What is it that the developer needs from their perspective? But if a security department exists, what is it that they need? And those are very different things. Likewise, I had to get started with, well, how do I go about technology adoption? So I want to raise awareness about my project, my company, and I want to engage with the community, so how do I do that? Where do I find them? If I have a new release to the open source project or a commercial product, how do I get people to use it? Right? And those are some of the questions that I think maybe swirl around the heads of a lot of people who are getting involved with developer relations. And then similarly, I have new stakeholders. You know, if you change a new job, you have a new project that you're working on, how do you report progress? How do you show that value and report what's going on to the team? So I had to ask these questions of, well, what does success look like for DevRel? What measures or metrics should I report on? What should be in my dashboard? What should be in my PowerPoints? And how do I use that to show value? So that's kind of where I was when I found out about the DevRel Foundation. And so, okay, well, what was the DevRel Foundation? It's on a mission to elevate the professional practice of developer relations and increase awareness of it as a driver of business value. So transitioning from one role, one industry to another, it was suddenly okay, well, here's an opportunity for me to go out and sort of reset and question any assumptions and say, hey, should there be a different way for me to go about this? Is there a better way I should, hit the ground running and sort of take that evaluation in mind? And so as the foundation was in this intent to form state, there were the creation of working groups. And so one of those working groups was the resources working group, and that was the one that I kind of gravitated to because I like organizing information, I like to sort of track things, so it seemed like an appropriate thing. And the charter for this working group was to aggregate and make accessible assets that support DevRel practitioners. And I was like, great, that's what I want. What do we got? But we were a new working group, so we didn't have anything yet. But our mission here for this group was to create a library of developer personas to guide engagement strategies. And so then it was like a question, okay, what does that mean? What should that look like? What form should it take? If you've initiated any open source projects, a lot of those questions take shape, especially when it's, okay, this is the vision, but what does that mean pragmatically? Curate a directory of DevRel specific software and tools. If you've seen, there is a GitHub repository, Awesome DevRel. There's lots of awesome lists out there. These are great resources, so it's like, well, if that already exists, is that just the answer, or is there something missing from that? Maybe people were aware of it, but I was aware of it, but I also wasn't finding myself using it or finding what I needed from it. So what was that gap? What project would this working group work on that would actually create something new of value to the DevRel practitioners? Likewise, maintaining an events directory to support participation in relevant industry events. There are a lot of event listings out there, right? I can go to Linux Foundation, look at events. There's many that are really good as well. But then I started thinking about it, well, in my role planning a program, yeah, if I was looking for a speaking session, open CFPs, that's pretty well covered, but there's lots of other use cases. And so those were sort of some of the problems we kicked off as we were starting this resources working group. So let me explore a few of the things, now fast forward 6 months later, DevRel Foundation officially blessed now, and we have a few of these projects now that are a result of what some of those questions were. So I'm gonna dive into a couple of these examples. So one of the projects, we described it as the tools catalog. So it became, well, what is a tool? It's a digital or physical item that aids in the completion of a DevRel task. And so, as I said, there are lists out there. So what's the problem with them? A couple of things: categorical ambiguity. So if you're familiar with the fact that you need a particular tool to do a particular job, you might know the right label for it. You might be able to ask someone what they're using. But there is a chance that if you're at that stage of trying to adopt a new technology, you might not know the right label. You may not know what a Gartner category is that covers your area. You may not know which foundation project it belongs to know that you're looking for supply chain, or you're looking for static analysis tools, and what terminology you might be searching for. Likewise, it isn't just an awareness of the tool. So, in some ways, this is flipping the script around, right? DevRel, usually we're promoting, our own products or tools or projects. But on the flip side, think about how we adopt tools and projects. And so I was like, well, it's not just the existence of the tool. I need to know, how do I learn about it? How do I get it set up? Is there a community to support me to support my community? And so that's a little bit meta here. And likewise, there is a little bit of bias in some of these static lists, right? If someone, any of the awesome lists that are out there, someone's maintaining and curating it, taking contributions, but it's almost a race to the top, right? Each new one gets added to the top. And so there's not necessarily a clear way of going to it. So basically now I'm going to say, how many different ways can you over-engineer a list? So in phase one, what we really focused on was, well, can we actually standardize the schema around this? Is that valuable to actually look at that? And so we wanted to say, okay, well, how would people contribute to this list? Is it a user interface, or is it just a markdown file? And if so, how do we validate it, right? So again, to remove some of that bias, create a sort of a neutral environment, but also to make sure that information is all there. When I look at a lot of other lists around tools and things like that, there might be a little bit of a description, but not really a full description of how you would learn about it, where you would go to get started. Maybe there's a link to a main website, but if other people within developer relations roles are doing this, presumably we have some of that information available to share. So, thinking about it a little bit more also led to, well, is it really just about jobs to be done, right? So am I looking for tools based on a label, or am I looking at it because I'm trying to accomplish a task? So when I'm in a particular situation, or I'm motivated to accomplish a particular thing, or I'm trying to produce a particular outcome, that's usually a driver of technology adoption, right? So even within DevRel, if I am looking to solve a particular problem, I'm probably looking at it through that lens. There's something I would want a tool to do for me so that I don't have to necessarily do it myself manually. Likewise, I do need to know that the tool exists, but it's also how do I evaluate it and how do I accomplish the job I set out for using it in the first place. And so a little bit of a focus on evaluation criteria as well as tutorials. So presumably in developer relations, we want people to use our tools, so we focus on education. Well, similarly here, if we're adopting tools, we're evaluating the onboarding experience for other tools that we use, even just to do our own thing. So just to give it maybe a little bit more of a concrete example, like Svelte, right? So if you go out and typically look at a tool like this, you could choose Hugo or Jekyll, one of the others, static site generators. But of course that assumes you know static site generators is the label of the thing that you're looking for. You might be thinking of it as a front-end framework or a markdown processor, but there are multiple labels you might look at to see what are my options and which one should I use. You might start talking to other people in one of the communities. Is there a lot of support for that tool? But generally, in this case, through this lens, we're saying, well, within developer relations, there are certain job categories we have to accomplish. We have to do technical writing. We have to do developer marketing. We sometimes have to do software development or web development. And so if the outcomes I'm looking for is to make a technical blog or publish documentation, create a developer portal, and so on, I'm going to compare different sets of tools based on that outcome. So like for instance, if I'm trying to create a website versus an API documentation solution, I might have a different set of tools. Some might go all the way down to the static site generator. There are other higher level tools that will do some of that automation for me. But that's really what I'm evaluating is sometimes it's a buy versus build, but there's a mix there. So if I think back to what my problem was from application security, setting up a new program, so I might have something like, oh, I need to schedule social media posts so that I can engage with the Windows community, with the Linux community, and so on. How do I do that on a regular cadence? And remember, do I do that manually just through sheer force of effort? Many DevRel teams are small, so this is a very common tool that someone might use. How do I select it and learn it? So that is really the heart of what the tools catalog is about sharing some of these tools, but at that deeper level of understanding what it accomplishes for DevRel, which in effect is also defining all of the things that someone who is doing DevRel has to accomplish as part of their role. Another project we started looking at was this persona problem. And so if you're familiar with personas, a persona is a research-based semi-fictional representation of the target audience of users, embodying characteristics, behaviors, goals, and pain points. So I started thinking about how would we solve this problem and give something of value, not just to anyone who's practicing DevRel or in a DevRel adjacent kind of role. And a couple of the problems identified was a lot of times these persona efforts, and I've sat through a lot of persona workshops where you'll find a lot of people will gather, start sharing, well, who is that person that we're trying to target with our project? What is it they're looking for? What problems do they have? And a lot of times what I've found is that that'll get put on the shelf, and then new people join the company, they forget that happened, and it's never really used. So some of the thoughts behind that is that it's too generic sometimes. Sometimes it's too specific to be applicable. Sometimes it's just too specific to a particular department or point of reference, too difficult to use. A lot of times these personas are little pictures or templates that you put up on the wall and kind of glance at and then never really go down that way again. And so we also don't typically share our personas across organizations. So if anyone is doing it well and getting a lot of value out of it, they're not sharing it openly. And one of the things I thought was interesting was I've actually ended up getting into some conversations with other Linux Foundation projects that had a similar problem, which was, well, are using these, or who are the people that are interested in the foundation or this particular project, and how do we categorize that information? And so, again, this has been quoted by some other people, but at the end of the day, personas are like toothbrushes. It's a great idea, but nobody wants to use somebody else's, is what it really was finding. And so part of this project then became another one. How do we over-engineer a slideshow or a template? So a couple of the things that we really accomplished in sort of the first phase of this project was gathering some of the terminology. So if you have not done persona development before, but have found it kind of an interesting area of like, well, maybe that's something that we've been missing to guide some of our decisions. One was coming up with a glossary. So if not heard of your ideal customer profile or a buyer persona versus a user persona or market segmentation, there's a lot of terminology that becomes part of this process. And so we started a glossary related to that. Also a reference library. There are books published on the topic going all the way back to the first documented reference of inmates running the asylum from a user experience design perspective, all the way up to developer relations conferences that are presenting on this topic and how everybody's doing it wrong without necessarily guidance on how to do it correctly. But there is, for a deeper study around personas, I think there's, a few dozen resources, blog posts, videos, as well as books. But the next step to this was really creating that schema. So if we were defining a persona, is it, instead of a template, is it data? And is it something that we can represent as data and transform and share across organizations? And so that was actually what we set out to do, was collect information about different personas that might work across different projects, different people, as a way of understanding community and who's in a community and how we engage with a community. So, it's basically an open data project with a bunch of validation tools to check if someone contributes to it, are we maintaining some consistency here as opposed to a more free-form text solution or, like I said, a single slideshow deck. The other part of this first phase was building tutorials. So I found when some of the conversations, a lot of the problems people had with personas was they didn't know how to use them. And so we created one specific tutorial was, if you had your personas and you're planning a content strategy for DevRel, what you're going to blog about, what you're going to put in newsletters, how would you use the personas as part of that process? And so, a lot of times at different companies, we might be using Airtable or Notion or a spreadsheet to manage content delivery and process. And so it really is about setting up a tie that each of those posts maps to a persona so that we're using it as part of the day-to-day process as opposed to a one-time activity that gets shelved. And so a couple of the ideas behind this project was that what we really wanted was a shorthand notation. So if we're thinking about a community at large, there are personality tests. I don't know if any of you have taken personality tests, but a lot of times it's a shorthand notation. So in communicating, you might say that you're a particular categorization in Myers-Briggs or the Strengths Finder or the Enneagram system. So given something like that, could we do something similar for developer communities and developer projects, that there's a shorthand notation that even if you're working across projects and tools, that we can understand who's part of which community as a shorthand. And then similarly, I've found that a lot of these types of projects around developing personas focuses on some of those traits that don't really matter because they're very biographical, like age or gender or geography, as opposed to the behavioral traits. And so that was a lens that this was taken. And so when I started in this application security space, it was trying to understand what are the needs of a development team, what are the needs of a security engineer, and where do they overlap or where do they diverge? And so this persona library has a definition of the canonical developer. It has the typical buyer or a business person, but allows for a little bit of a further refinement. So there is also a typical security industry developer. There is the typical security industry buyer, and then becomes a persona set specific for my company that inherits from the other personas that are a little bit more industry-wide. So what that allows is a little bit more of an exchange of these atomic traits that, hey, this is not unique to my company anymore. It's something that's true for all developers. So for someone who's trying to understand a particular industry or to understand just a particular role, because if you're in a developer marketing type of role, you may not be familiar with how to speak properly to a developer to be effective. And so that was one of the core ideas here. And so basically this has taken this form of having a lot of traits that try to be very discrete, so that you're going to have one of the traits but not necessarily another across a bunch of different categories. And so this does include the ability to drill down into vertical industry segment, the role, function, experience, and level, organizational characteristics such as the maturity or go-to-market of it, which typically you might think of as a startup versus a larger enterprise, what behaviors, some of the motivations like likes, dislikes, goals, and then the key point being some of the strategies. So for each lens, that like if you're in a marketing role and you're trying to think about how to interact with a particular persona, you would only look at a presentation that gives you that lens. It will give you additional context as well. It's the job titles, channels, skills, which becomes part of an engagement strategy. So at this stage, it's just the data model, but very quickly it became apparent in some of our discussions that an LLM on top of this, a user interface on top of this, gives you a lens in which you're interacting with personas in a way that's very specific to an industry or profile of what you're interacting with. And the persona problem then doesn't become, how do I create this fictitious story about something versus actually taking something out of a general collection, just customizing it a little bit, but also being able to take downstream updates to that persona and hire an agency to work with you, or a consultant who shares a common language so that we know who we're talking about as the ideal person that we're targeting. So again, taking a step back to application security, some of the characteristics and behaviors. Security engineers typically care about risk. Developers typically care about shipping features. Those goals are sometimes not always aligned. And so having a solution and how we communicate it may depend on that persona. And so when we're writing stories, when we're doing newsletters, when we're going and selecting events, knowing which audience we're going to and how we're talking to them was a problem I needed to be able to solve. So as I said, my title even started focusing on developer relations, and within application security communities, that was almost exclusionary because of the different departments and the relationship between them. That became almost, the door was shut because, you focus on developers, not security. But broadening that to a security advocacy, advocating for security across developers and across security teams becomes a little bit more welcoming into starting that conversation. And so from a DevRel perspective, understanding that at a deeper level across the different personality types when you go to a DevOps conference, or if you go to an open source conference and so on, when you're trying to get adoption of your project, how do you engage with someone that you haven't met before and you haven't had enough conversations with? And then there is something I alluded to there, which is around the personas, is a tie-in to events. So there are lots of resources out there for events, no intention of actually duplicating it, but there is that awareness thing. So it becomes, what channels does a particular persona use, which would suggest where I want to deliver content to. What events does a particular persona attend? That leads to the types of engagement strategies I would have as a DevRel practitioner in those communities. So again, at the lower level, this is a data model. At a higher level, it's a user interface that allows us to explore and understand communities at a little bit more atomic level. So thinking it back to my challenges within application security. So what events does the security community attend? What might they care about around open source? What ways are appropriate to sponsor or participate within those communities? And so that is really the goal of the events directory, is to look at the existing
data sources around of events, but annotate them basically with additional context that someone in DevRel would want to know. Is this an event I actually want to sponsor and go to? Do I have justification for going there because the persona of my project is there, or other similar characteristics? And then that last challenge I had mentioned was, again, about reporting progress in the role and team structure. This is the next level of investigation, is some of the projects around a metrics index as well as a maturity model. And so it's how do we communicate that business value back to folks? There is a lot of discussion around metrics and how to measure, or what metrics are important. There's very little documented evidence of what tools you actually use, how you actually capture it, and how you benchmark it against other programs. And that is, what maybe differentiates something that we're looking at here as far as this metrics index project is the very pragmatic, not just a definition of a metric, but here's your playbook to go get running with it. And on the maturity model, it's another thing that it's a very common refrain within developer relations, is that it depends on, it depends. Are you in marketing? And actually, I have been in marketing, I have been in sales, I have been in engineering, and I have been in product, as well as sort of an independent DevRel org. I have not seen finance or HR yet, but there's still time. But in terms of maturity model, that is actually probably an element that we see, is that a lot of startups might be looking for DevRel to cover a lot of different areas, whereas you get into a larger enterprise that has a larger team, very different characteristics. If you're on an open source project, you have no one dedicated to it. You might actually be looking at someone who's in a different role, but needs to act as if they are DevRel and handle some of these characteristics. And so that's sort of the tie-in. So a couple of these projects too, we are using similar lifecycle language as some of the other projects like OpenSSF and Cloud Native. So a lot of these projects are still in the sandbox stage, early POC, a little bit around like data modeling, and lots of questions under discussion. But that's what we're trying to push forward with some of these. Let's see how we're doing on time. Coming in close. So again, the DevRel Foundation exists to help elevate the professional practice of developer relations, whether you call it developer relations or not. That is, to a certain extent, what we're doing. We're engaging with technical communities and trying to assist them in finding the value. So there is a lot more information at devrel.org/join about not only joining the community, but how to go from just a lurker to participating to leading. So we have some time for questions. And there's a little bit of contact info about me, as well as about the DevRel Foundation.
This might be too big of a question, but can you dig in a little bit more on that example you had of like, what's their business value in sending a bid to an event? And like, how you use the tools?
The events directory versus or from a metrics point of view?
Yeah.
So it was one of the ideas. I can dig into this a little bit. So the metrics index definitely on the sandbox stage, and we have a few people that are part of the working group now that have done metrics development at other corporations at various sizes. And so that question comes up a lot, right? Is how do you prove that value of sending someone? You know there's a cost, but there's various goals, and sometimes that measurement is a little bit imprecise. But one way I like to think about it from some of the activities that I do is attention hours. I've kind of really appreciated this notion of normalizing how we look at different types of activities and which ones give long-term impact. So take a particular conference. I could say, for a half hour, I had all of your attention, and that gives me a baseline. I could have also spent this time writing a blog post, and that blog post would go out and would have some set of views, and each of those views time on page. both of those can be normalized to how much attention we get, and sometimes that attention will be a one-time thing, right? Like here, hopefully, all of you got at least something of value out of that. But whether that translates to business value is, of course, the question. But the assumption is that if you maintain attention over a period of time, that increases, from a marketing message, repetition, awareness of an item. And so when you understand that you have a particular need, it becomes a percentage game, right? So sort of modeling, like I could go off and talk to 10 people in the data and see like, hey, these 10 people originally, had a first touch opportunity, became business, so I can extrapolate that to the population overall of people who are signing up. But I think that gets into the problem that we are hoping to solve with the metrics index is there's a little bit hand waving there, not really talking specifically, use this tool to gather this data, take that data with this data, and in fact, here's a tutorial on how to do that, and use this library because it will actually generate a report for you in this particular data analytics tool, and that's what you need in order to communicate effectively. So now I think we do have a lot of people that are doing those things, but we haven't automated it in a way that we can share those best practices across. Does that give you a little bit of context?
Would you follow up with, would you add a coefficient to one of those metrics? Like, I was a product manager, and we love to put subjective coefficients on things.
I think it has to be. One of the conversations yesterday is, well, what is a product? Or, if you're looking at a project, is it only the software, or is it the fact that you have the software that also comes with documentation, that also comes with support, that also comes with a coffee once a month by meeting your account manager, right? Like there's an entire experience. For a while, there was also an iteration of developer relations and developer experience that may include the actual hands-on pragmatic, what the APIs are like, what the tutorials are like, but it's also just that sum of events of the overall experience and feeling of confidence in a particular product. How you measure all of that, most physical products and services don't do that either. So, but we have a higher expectation because when we look at a lot of technical products and projects, we can measure downloads. So it feels like we can get to that level of precision when we maybe don't have, so it becomes an expectation setting exercise, in my opinion. Any other questions? So early days on some of these projects. I'm hoping that it's at least enough to be a little bit intrigued to follow along as these get a little bit farther. The website is going to be a good resource because a lot of them are at the data modeling phase, but as we move closer to that next level, that's where that information then starts being exposed to be in a much more user-friendly approach, but also to accept contributions more that way.